My name is Paul Elie. I'm an author and senior fellow in the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. And I'm pleased to have a really distinguished group of guest commentators today to talk about Pope Francis, this conflict in the Vatican, and its implications for the future of Catholicism. Our guest today, I'll go try to go Hollywood Square style from upper left and work down. Uelmen is a lecturer in religion and professional life and a special advisor to the dean at Georgetown Law, and also a senior research fellow at the Berkley Center on Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. She's the author of many publications, articles, books, and the like. She's also served as a consultant for the Focolare Movement's Economy of Communion project, in which businesses operate according to principles of responsibility to the larger community and share profits with the poor. Massimo Faggioli is a church historian, professor of theology and religious studies at Villanova University, and contributing writer to Commonweal magazine, and a tweeter in several languages. Those of you who follow his Twitter feed know that it's just a very dynamic source for what's going on in the Church in the United States, in Italy, and worldwide. He has a new book about Pope Francis called The Liminal Papacy of Pope Francis, which is just out, and we're very happy to be able to do this event on the occasion of the publication of the book. Christopher Lamb also has a new book out. Chris is the Tablet's permanently accredited correspondent to Rome and the Holy See. He's also contributed to BBC, La Stampa. His new book is The Outsider, Pope Francis and His Battle to Reform the Church, published not so long ago by Orbis Books, the same publisher that brought out Massimo's book. Shaun is the director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown. During the Obama administration, Shaun was the U.S. Special Representative for Religion and Global Affairs and director of the U.S. Department of State's Office of Religion and Global Affairs. He's the author of The Making of a Catholic President, Kennedy versus Nixon, 1960. So welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us. Reading the two books side by side, Massimo's book and Chris's book, I couldn't help but notice the attention that the two authors give to the notion of Pope Francis, an outsider. What this has meant for his time prior to being a pope, what it's meant for the early moments of his pontificate, and then what it means 7 years on, to what extent, whether and how the perspective of an outsider has shaped his pontificate, to what extent the perspective of an outsider has been the cause, even if a good cause, of some of the difficulties and conflicts that we're seeing in Rome and the Vatican right now. So I'd like to just ask first, Chris, could you explain what it means, as you understand it, for Pope Francis to be an outsider?
Well, thank you, Paul. Thank you, Georgetown, the Berkley Center, for having me. In my book, The Outsider, if you'll forgive the little plug there, I call Pope Francis the outsider very simply because he's the first pope to be elected for many years, many decades, who has never lived or studied in Rome before his election. So came to the role with that background. So that was the kind of obvious thing for me as to why I wanted to call him the outsider, or book The Outsider. He has not had the traditional career trajectory of senior prelates. He was leader of the Jesuits in Argentina, and then had a period in a sort of exile period, and then was parachuted back into the hierarchy in Argentina. But he didn't have that kind of step-by-step rise that you normally see cardinals have. And I also call Francis the outsider because he has associated his papacy with the outsiders, the people who are often left on the scrap heap of life. He's spoken out for migrants and refugees. He has made his papacy about serving the marginalized. He's the Pope who opens up the Sistine Chapel to the homeless, and wants to focus relentlessly on those people, often, as he calls it, discarded or forgotten. So it's for that reason that I gave the book the title that I did. And I think the outsider status of Francis is what has in many ways stirred up some of the opposition, because he's made a number of people in the establishment, in the positions of power and influence in the church, uncomfortable, because he's challenged them with his ministry and with his message. He challenged, I think, the whole church, but he's particularly challenged those who have been more of the insiders. So I hope that gives a shape as to why I've given Francis that moniker, the outsider.
Very much so. When I first read your book during the winter, I was teaching part of a course at Georgetown that had to do with Camus and his book The Stranger, which in England is called The Outsider. So I got this idea of Francis as sort of existentialist outsider, like Dostoevsky's man writing the notes from underground, huddled outside of society. And then after that, I read somewhere that that's a key book for Francis, Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. Now, Massimo, in your presentation of Francis as an outsider, it's to use a word that the two of you both use at different points, polyhedric or polyhedric. He's an outsider in many ways and in many senses. And one of them that you mentioned is that he's really more of a literary pope than a theological or diplomatic pope. But what does it mean for you to reckon with Pope Francis as an outsider?
I titled my book Liminal because this adjective liminal, both in English but also in the Romance languages, has to do with two Latin words. One is limen and the other is limes. And so limes means frontier in a more military fashion, if you want. But a limen is kind of a threshold. It's that space where things make a transition and not in a violent way. So I think Pope Francis is a liminal pope in two senses, especially. One, because of geography. He's the first pope who's not European, who's not Mediterranean even. And so that opens Catholicism and the papal office to a new dimension. And so he is breaking a taboo that the office of the papacy is the legacy of the European church and so on. And then there's an historical, chronological liminality, because Francis is the first pope in many centuries who has been elected after the resignation of a pope, and of a pope, Benedict, who couldn't really become a hermit. He couldn't disappear. And he also says that in the biography that has been published in Germany 2 weeks ago. And so Francis has to occupy this liminal space geographically, because he has to make this transition from European papacy to a global one, but also chronologically because he has the very difficult task to be the successor of a pope who didn't die, or actually he wanted to die to the papacy, but he couldn't, as we all know. It's impossible for a highly visible office to disappear from the public view just because of a stroke of a pen. And so it's a very sophisticated and difficult role. And I totally agree with Chris that he's the perfect man for this liminality, because he owes, I think, nothing to the Roman circles, which is typical of all popes of these last few centuries, because they have either studied there, worked there, or had much more commerce with them as archbishops and so on. And so liminality, it's my way to say there's a big transition going on that is still unaccomplished, because of course Benedict is still alive. He has drafted a text we know exists, but we don't know where that is, when it was. So it's an influx election of Francis that started in March 2013, But in some sense, I mean, 86 months later, it's still unaccomplished. It's still evolving, I think.
I find this notion of the liminal pontificate, owing to the fact that Benedict resigned rather than dying, tremendously stimulating, and I don't remember encountering it anywhere, this Oedipal reading of the papacy where, as you describe it, the conclave is a kind of killing of the father. The previous popes died by natural causes or whatever. The conclave puts that pope to rest and really buries that pope, bringing another one in, and that didn't happen in the same way this time. At the same time, I mean, it's tremendously stimulating, and Massimo's book has 6 or 8 or 10 other ways in which Pope Francis is a liminal pope and an outsider to the ecclesial culture of Rome and the narratives of Vatican history and so forth. All that said, I want to push back at it a little bit, and I'm going to invite Amy and Shaun to weigh in here, because as liminal as he is, and as much of an outsider as he is, coming from Argentina, coming from the Jesuits, coming from a life spent mainly in Argentina, he is nevertheless an important male prelate archbishop who was a key figure in Aparecida, a crucial transformative event in South America. He was a relator, had an important position at a synod in Rome when he stepped in after Cardinal Egan had to remain in New York following the World Trade Center attacks. He was the runner-up to Benedict in the last election. This is, as viable as the idea of Francis as an outsider is, it has those things running against it, and it also has running against it the fact that Pope after Pope is characterized as an outsider. John Paul was an outsider because he was Polish. Benedict was an outsider because he was a theologian. John the 23rd was an outsider because he'd been the Patriarch of Venice instead of being in the diplomatic corps. I mean, how much, let's say, to narrow things down, Amy and Shaun, from an American context, how much does it matter that Pope Francis' narrative doesn't conform to prior Vatican narratives in the way that that Chris and Massimo have suggested? Amy?
I think one of the delightful aspects of Massimo's book is also when he compares Francis to John the 23rd.
It's an extended comparison that goes on over several pages. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think actually both books appreciate the complexity, but I too am looking for ways to get beyond a kind of binary frame of inside outside, and I think the appreciation of multiple layers in history, and that bring us across how are we interacting among generations, across geography, across different ways of understanding law and rules, for example, would be an important difference also for the North American framework. So I think both books help us get at those layers of complexity. So it's probably reductive to just zero in on inside versus outside, and there's lots of other criteria to bring into the mix.
So that's, in a way, a combination of inside and outside is going to be true of most of the figures that I've mentioned. Shaun, I had in mind Kennedy, really, because you've written about him. Kennedy was an outsider as the first Catholic president, but he'd gone to Choate and Harvard. His father was deeply involved in democratic politics. He'd been the ambassador to the Court of St. James. This was not an outsider in many respects. It was an insider. And I wouldn't want to analogize too glibly between Pope Francis and John F. Kennedy, but you see what I'm getting at, right?
Sure, and I guess what I would like to focus in on is the Francis is an international diplomat, and let me, if I can, I can pose a version of that question to both Chris and to Massimo, and then I'll shut up because I'm really.
Please don't.
But well, so Chris, you tell this remarkable story, which I think is very symbolic of when Ambassador Callista Gingrich and her husband Newt Gingrich attend a public meeting that's celebrating the 35th anniversary of diplomatic relations between the U.S. and the Holy See. And you describe a picture where Benedict is sitting in between the two Americans, both political, one's a diplomat, one's a former Speaker of the House. And you say very deftly that this seems to be a political signal to the supporters of Benedict and the detractors of Francis that Benedict is our guy. And it's breathtaking to think of an American ambassador sending that kind of overt political signal. So I guess my question to you, Chris, would be, is that how that was interpreted within sort of the Roman diplomatic corps or the Vatican diplomatic corps? And Massimo, my question to you, I really found at the end of your book, when you sort of look at how do you place Francis as a diplomat, and particularly you talk about the dissonance between the Trump administration's foreign policy and the Vatican's, but you skip over the first 3 years of Francis's diplomacy when it was John Kerry as the ambassador who I worked for and Barack Obama. And I argued to my boss, Secretary Kerry, when he made his first trip to meet with then Archbishop Parolin, soon to be Cardinal, that the overlap between Francis's priorities as he had laid them out in his first speech to the Vatican diplomatic corps and John Kerry's own foreign policy, there was about an 80% overlap between their two priorities. And there was this brief 3-year period where in many ways it was unprecedented, at least in the history of U.S. And Vatican diplomacy, where on issues like the environment, on Cuba, on refugees, Israel, Palestinian peace, there was this amazing overlap in a lot of, frankly, great collaboration. So I'm wondering if you might reflect a little bit more on perhaps that might be an interesting model or maybe a better sample of Francis at his most robust diplomatically.
So just to sum up, Chris, Shaun wonders about that episode in which the Gingriches were pictured with Pope Benedict as our guy, and what were the diplomatic implications of that when there's an actual Pope, Pope Francis, who's not their guy. And then Massimo, much in your book is, you have a lot to say about Francis as standing apart from both the EU and from the USA as its American policy as it's constituted under President Trump. And what Shaun's asking is, what about those points of concord that existed for several years between President Obama, Secretary of State Kerry, and Pope Francis? So, Chris?
Okay, well, thank you for the question. I'm not saying that the ambassador and Mr. Gingrich, Speaker Gingrich, were trying to make a particular point. What I'm saying is that that meeting was used by those people who would like to try and undermine Francis, or would like to use the office of the Pope Emeritus to drive the wedge between this pontificate and Benedict, and that's happened consistently throughout the Francis papacy. And I think one of the problems is that you have, for the first time, two men in the Vatican wearing white calling themselves Pope. And so you therefore have a problem of symbols, and Catholic theology and tradition requires there's one Pope, and so there is a problem with this these conflicted symbols, and unfortunately it allows a lot of mischief making. And I think in that incident, I highlighted that incident because I showing how easy it is for this to happen. And of course, the picture was taken. It was on the eve of the feast of St. Peter and Paul, the great feast of the Petrine ministry. And the picture was then put out on social media. It was obviously sanctioned by Benedict's secretary, Archbishop Ganswein, who we know is not always, how can we say, in lockstep with Francis. So this is where you get the problem. And there you have a US ambassador to the Holy See. I have no doubt well-intentioned, wanting to mark 35 years of diplomatic relations. But when you go to Benedict XVI's house, have a photo, put it out in that way, it was read as I wrote. That's how the people in Rome read it, as the people in the Vatican saw it. It was seen as saying, well, look, actually, we are simpatico with Benedict. So what I'm saying is you have a confusion of symbols. There is a need to reform the office of the Pope Emeritus. And you have people who are trying to use the office of the Pope Emeritus to undermine Francis.
And I would say too that I think that Pope Francis has related to the U.S. ambassadorship to the Holy See with great finesse and great understanding. I mean, really would have been very easy for them to just simply distance themselves from the American embassy. And I don't think that's taken place. I think that actually shows the deep sophistication in the second section of the Secretary of State, but also in the Pope's mind itself, that they have to manage this relationship with great care and great sophistication. And I think from the outset, they've shown that, much to their credit.
Yeah, I think there's very good channels of dialogue between, as you say, the second section of the Secretary of State and the embassy. I think there's been a lot of collaboration, despite clearly tensions and differences. But I suppose that's how Pope Francis, as a global actor, operates. His door is open to discussion, but he's not going to compromise on the core position.
That's right. And I think too, they have the Pope has interlocutors on this side of the Atlantic, helping to interpret the complex politics of the Trump administration to them as well. And I think they've been well served by some of those sources in managing a fraught relationship.
Can I just add in a layer of questions, also referring then to Massimo's work as well? Chris, thinking particularly of the challenges of the way in which images get picked up by the media, tweeted, short kinds of communications, it seems to me like the conversation can benefit so much from the kinds of complexity that both of you bring into your work. And I'm thinking, especially when Massimo says there's 7 layers that we need to consider of the history. And so I'm just curious from both of you, actually, how do we navigate as just people in the pew, the need for a complex understanding of the message that Pope Francis is bringing in a world that just makes that so difficult because of the tendency toward quick images and sound bites and Twitter? So that's maybe just a general question for both of you.
May I?
Massimo, please.
So I'll start first with Amy's question. So I'm Italian, and I tend by formation to be skeptical of institutional communication of the Vatican. But in this situation, I think that the safest, perfect way is to rely on institutional communication of the Vatican, which is much less the palace speaking, because that is how it used to be. And so right now we see on the Osservatore Romano, for example, articles that are quite atypical. And so, but I rely much more on the institutional channels, because they are, I think, much more not just faithful to Francis, but faithful to what the church is about in this very complicated age with 2 men in white and so on. And so this is my very, very simple answer.
But what you're saying then is that, and please go on, but you're saying that historically you got the simple answer from the institution, and in this moment it's the institution that's offering a more complex answer that is then simplified by the media, Massimo?
I think it is. If you
in a real reversal of traditional or historical pattern?
Sure. If you just look at l'Osservatore Romano, for example, the official newspaper of the Holy See, but also Civiltà Cattolica, for example, you have there the most interesting and honest assessment of big theological issues, political issues, which is no longer the one voice you're supposed to hear, but it's a multifaceted set of voices, of concerns, of cultures. So I don't read Chinese, but I can only imagine what it means for Chinese Catholics to have the official magazine of the Jesuits that constitutionally are faithful to the sovereign of Vatican City State to be published in Chinese. And so it was unimaginable until a few years ago. So here there's a reversal. So here you have the independent Catholic voices that, in my opinion, are much more dependent on some hidden agendas. While the officially dependent Catholic voices of the Vatican are much more honest and transparent in saying, we talk on behalf of the one Bishop of Rome. So this is a big reversal, I think, and it's interesting as an observer, because I don't write for them. I mean, occasionally, but I'm not one of them. But there's an institutional face that I think is much more reliable than before, when you knew that and much of other stuff was going on and they didn't want to let you know. But now you know that all the rest is independent media, and much of that is noise and mischief and so on. That's how I see it.
So this raises a couple of possibilities based on my sense of your book and Chris's book. Let me put the question about how this gives rise to conflict in Rome, park that for a moment. But what the two of you seem to suggest, and I'm just going to try to frame this in light of what Massimo just said, is that part of what's so powerful about Francis' pontificate and what makes him something of an outsider is the way he's managed to sustain a kind of complexity. He supports the original project of the EU, but not its technocratic excesses. He supports the religious diversity of the United States without some of the shrill binary framing of the political issues that Amy mentioned. He supports the prerogatives of the Pope while also emphasizing subsidiarity and synodality. Is it this complexity in itself that's vexing his detractors, Chris?
I think
if that's a fair summary, anyway.
I think some of the ambiguity upsets some of the detractors who want certain kind of black and white clarity on some topics. I think, yes, he's able to hold different things in tension, and he's I would say he's difficult to trap, and that's a problem, I think, for the people who are opposed to him. But I think really, in many respects, if you want to look at the questions where he's been accused of ambiguity, let's say divorced and remarried, the question of whether communion can be, or the sacraments can be given to divorced and remarried, on that, he's really in line of the tradition of the church, I would say. It's really a kind of this false binary that's created, which he's refused to fall into. And I think he refuses to be trapped into the binary questions. And in that sense, he is very much in the tradition, the Catholic tradition of the both and tradition. And I think that is, yes, that is part of why some people who are opposed to Francis find him frustrating.
So a question for Shaun based on that. So, I'm a writer and literary critic. I love complexity and ambiguity. But from a diplomatic standpoint, are there downsides to having a head of state who is frankly and forthrightly saying it's complicated? Laudato Si is a fantastic example of that. It's so complicated that I, in some ways, don't know where to start. Can it pose problems from the point of view of diplomacy and international relations?
think from a purely traditional standpoint, yes, but I think what you have to pair with that is that we had a president in the United States who was a complex dialectical thinker himself. And he both enraged the right and the left, because he would say, well, on the one hand, X, on the one hand, Y, on the other hand, Y, therefore he would look for some synthesis in between. And so there was for lack of a better term, there was a pragmatic approach to global affairs on both sides of the U.S.-Vatican relationship under the Obama administration. So, I think back to Carrie's first conversation with Pearline. They ran through this list of issues. They were half an hour overtime, and the Vatican minders were all doing like this to Pearline, like wrap it up. And at the very end, I guess I'm on thin ice here. Archbishop Pearline said, well, this has been a fantastic conversation, but Mr. Secretary, I must register on the behalf of our brother bishops in the United States their concern with respect to the healthcare provision about universal care that would include contraception and access to abortion services. And Carrie nodded his head and said, message received. So it wasn't cordial, but at the end of this otherwise amazing conversation, there was this 90-second salute to some of the traditional issues. And then when the press release came out from the Vatican press office, that was the lead paragraph. It was a discussion about sexuality and the so-called...
Which had taken all of 10 seconds.
Right, exactly. And the truth was, these were two adult diplomats in the room who knew they didn't agree 100%, nor did their bosses. But they were pragmatic enough to find the issues that they both cared about. So, to me, that's diplomacy at its best. Diplomacy at its worst is where, well, say, Paul, you and I agree on 9 out of 10 things, and it's that 1 out of 10 that we disagree about, which is going to poison the whole relationship. Now, that historically is quite common in American diplomacy, but here I think you had this moment of realism, not in the dirtiest sense of realism with a capital R, but more pragmatic. That there was a new opportunity here because the overlap was so rich and so interesting that opened the door for so much work, while at the same time, both countries were able to acknowledge areas of deep disagreement. So I think the complexity actually opened up a rich set of possibilities and diplomatic possibilities.
And Amy, what I've heard you saying on the Mirror of Justice blog, for example, is that it's precisely this complexity that you're calling for, say, on the issue of whether and how to open churches to worship, but that the very complexity has trouble getting through the binary filter. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, I mean, if you take, for example, the current debate on what is essential, and I think that just invites a completely reductive way of reasoning, because to say what's more important, having liquor stores open or churches open, I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's compared to what and in what circumstances, and so, but I think the work that we need to do, and this is what has my curiosity about this conversation, the work that we need to do is to understand how to create the settings where we can have these more complicated and nuanced conversations. I know I reach for those in the classroom, and you can actually invite students to turn to each other and ask, what is at stake for you in this issue that's so contested? And I think the challenge that we have when there's essentially a performance and a need to affirm ultimate values without always getting to that much more nuanced discussion about what is it that we should actually do in order to protect people's public health and safety in certain contexts, and it could make a difference how big the church is, for example. But I think that what I find so challenging is the immediate move to a kind of binary on the basis of the need to appear as affirming an ideal that's out of context. And so that's where I think we need this kind of complex scholarship and commentary to come in to help us with a more complicated way of reasoning.
And this raises a question which came up again and again as I was reading Massimo's book. And then, Chris, I'd read your book back in February, but read it again over the weekend. It's a question that we need to try to answer, at least provisionally, in American politics, but let's just talk about Rome for now. The venomous, the aggression of Francis' detractors, is that because of a deep level of cognitive disagreement, or just a practical frustration with not having and controlling the microphone and the message? Or is it some combination of the two? Massimo?
So here, I think it's twofold, and I just want to answer also briefly to Shaun's question, which is about America. So I think that the frustration of the radical opposition against Francis in Rome, in the Vatican, has to do with the shocking awakening from the idea that the Vatican and the papacy is not what most of them were sure was going to be for the foreseeable future.
Sort of John Paul III approach that would carry through everything that had been done since 1978.
Even more, because I would say Benedict the 17th or Pius the 13th, because that was a real expectation, especially because it was part of the attempt to Americanize the Vatican and Catholicism in a certain way. And so they elected Francis, Bergoglio, also because of a certain black legend around him as a conservative Jesuit in Argentina in the 70s. That black legend has vaporized. It no longer exists. And so that's, I think the rage is against this awakening that you have a global pope who is largely disavowing that ideological project. That's one thing. And the second thing is this, I think, and Chris knows much more than I do, but my sense is this, is that he's not playing the usual curial game of playing on the chess board of the Vatican. His chessboard is much bigger. He uses many more players that are not knights or horses, or so, and that confuses the traditional actors there, and that's why I think they have gone rogue, Vigano and all this. And so here there is, and I think, honestly, to be critical 1 second of Francis, I think Francis sometimes has been a bit too Machiavellian with his opponents in the Vatican. So, some names I could give them to you, but I won't. But in general, I think he understood that for a pope like him, in a church like this, the chessboard was going to be much bigger and different. That's why they have tried almost everything. And Francis keeps being polite with them. And he has moved some of them, and Mueller and so on, but not as harshly and as swiftly as it has always happened with Francis' predecessors.
Chris, you have a bravura opening to your book, which involves Francis staying silent as Vigano accuses him. And we all, having been through the sexual abuse crisis, know that silence on the part of the church is deeply problematic. And yet you make a convincing case that he was playing this four-dimensional chess with his opponents by remaining silent at that moment. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's right. He certainly knows how to use silence, keep silent in the face of opposition. It goes back to what I was saying about refusing to be trapped. You have the questions from the cardinals about Amoris Laetitia on family life, the dubia, which he refused to answer. So he's refused to engage on the opponent's terms. I think the opposition to Francis is about power at one level, about the fact that Francis has ripped up the old rule book in many respects. Let's take, for example, the appointments of cardinals. There was an agreed ladder. If you got to a certain position in the church, you made a cardinal. No longer. the Pope appoints the bishop from Tonga a cardinal, or from El Salvador a cardinal. That's a big change, and that has upset people. And there is, of course, this also, you put it, the kind of venomous opposition against the Pope, which I think is not really theological. It's something deeper, because it's not really something that is worked out theologically. It is a sort of an irrational kind of hatred, I would say. That's one part of it. But I think there is a deep discomfort amongst some people in high positions in the church, because here is a Pope who is challenging them, and I write in the book, he challenges them, challenging them on the gospel. A lot of the opposition to Francis comes from that early morning mass that the Pope says, where he gives his homily on the gospel of the day off the cuff. This was in the Curia a big thing. Hang on a minute, you can't speak off the cuff. Every word the Pope says must be written down and agreed. He said, no. He gives a homily off the cuff. But this is the style of a parish priest, of the Latin American theologian, this is the style of liberation theology. This is the style of any parish priest. But in Rome and in the Curia, they were very worried. And I think my argument is it is a gospel challenge. And I think that is why he has had the opposition from the modern day doctors of the law and the religious authorities, because he has presented this very stark challenge to people in the church to try and live more closely to the Gospels.
This is the moment when those of us who are on the video who want to send in their questions should send them in. We've had a couple of questions already that speak to the moment of that. Not so long ago, Vigano put out another document essentially taking a paranoid view of the church's accession to state authority during the pandemic. And this is something we've seen in this country, of course, but just the latest kind of sharp edge of a movement among conservative prelates to suggest that Francis is an accommodationist in the worst way. At the same time, this is a moment in which, and I'm trying to address the second question that came in, Francis has just taken a big position on Christian ecumenism. So are the steps he's taking on ecumenism significant? And is that part of what is leading his opponents to brand him an accommodationist? Massimo?
So I think that Vigano's latest is relevant also because a number of cardinals have signed, and we know that others would have signed and actually agree. So this is relevant because they will be part of the next conclave probably, and so on. But that document is important, especially from a North American point of view, because it takes to an extreme a certain approach to the issue of the freedom of religion that has dominated the Catholic conversation in this country in these last 10 years, more or less, especially after Obamacare and the whole campaign of US bishops, the fortnight for freedom. So here, I think that Vigano is a particularly, extreme view in this document. But it's important for all of us because it shows how dangerous it is to look at the issue of the freedom of religion in this particular context, but generally with a purely legal approach. So if you read all documents that were published by the US bishops after 2010, they have been crafted largely by lawyers and in almost total absence of a theological argument on religious liberty, which is no longer the religious freedom of the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. These are called libertas ecclesiae, so which is defined by opposition against the political power only. but it's religious liberty for religion, religious groups, all of them. If you take the Vatican II part of that, which is more pluralistic, out of the equation, you fall back into a Middle Ages kind of mentality, which is Vigano's mentality. So that's why that document is important, not because that appeal will go anywhere, but because it is part of a certain deviation of what the real discussion should be, because there is a real rising global challenge against religious freedom. We know that. But if it's led out of a paranoid, which is in part postmodern and in part neo-medieval mentality, that becomes only a farce, I think, and goes into the dustbin of ideas together with the conspiracy theories. So that's why it says something beyond the usual cabal of Vigano's friends.
One thing that comes up, and I feel it stranding through some of the discussion that we've had so far, is how much this matters to Catholics on the ground, and especially to younger Catholics. Do younger Catholics have, say, Benedict is my Pope? Do younger Catholics concern themselves so much over the religious freedom issues that are so animated among men of 75 who remember when one didn't darken the door of a church that wasn't your own, and so forth? How representative are these conflicts of the conflicts in the life of the church, and how much are they just clerical back and forth? Amy, you and I have discussed this. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I find myself asking this question: how does this sort of play out on the ground, especially from a generational perspective? I remember even when I was in college in the late 80s, and some of my theology professors were bristling at the idea of a universal catechism as just not being complex enough. And I remember thinking, well, compared to what? I mean, also thinking about the formation and the challenges of my generation in terms of understanding the faith. And so I find myself asking those same questions in front of my students when they seem to be looking for more structure and more clarity and hanging on to certain aspects of the faith that seem to give them a sense of direction. And I would like to accompany them and be in conversation also where they are with their own kind of generational journey. And so I find myself curious about how these reflections on history and on inside and outside play out for younger Catholics who are searching for more security in their identity. And it's interesting, we just had a discussion about teaching in COVID, and somebody asked the students, what drove you the most crazy about this time? And they said, you could expect all kinds of answers, and they said lack of structure. What we're looking for is structured flexibility and flexible structure. And so I'd just be curious if how the generational questions percolate through both of your thinking, Chris and Massimo, as you think about these questions.
Let me pick that up and frame it to both of them in light of the questions that are coming in from viewers, because there's a theme that is clustering, I suppose. There's a long string of strong questions, and if I see a common question among them, it has to do with the exercise of papal authority, which I would say is analogous to structure that you're speaking about, Amy. Massimo, you memorably talked about the deregulation of backtalk in the Vatican, that this stuff always happened, we're just hearing it now. To what extent should, and I guess I would ask Chris and Massimo and Shaun all to speak to this, how is Francis managing authority in Rome? Should he be penalizing or disciplining his detractors? Or is he, on the other hand, too arbitrary and Machiavellian even in his exertion of authority sometimes, but not at other times? Is part of what what's so vexing about the conflicts we're seeing in the church right now, the fact that Francis does kind of let them play out in a way that's so uncharacteristic of a pope. Chris?
I think when he has been faced with full frontal opposition, he's tended to kind of bypass some challenges, and he hasn't always just got rid of a whole tranche of people. He's been careful in his approach. I think that I don't think he derives his authority by the curial power plays. I think he derives it from serving the people of God. And I think one of the issues in the Vatican and Rome, just to pick up on Amy's point as well, is that there are, I could say, some people or some interests who get a lot of play, who have a lot of influence, and they're not necessarily representative of the wider church. And I think that is one of the reasons why I think this stuff actually matters, because the bottom line is, in Rome, this is where the church's leaders are appointed. This is where the big decisions are made. This is where the direction of the church is. And I think that sometimes we've seen certain interests, certain groups having an outsized influence over appointments and over the decision making. And I think the Pope is trying to connect his office with the people of God. And I think sometimes you wonder in Rome, who is actually speaking for the ordinary Catholics, because there are these different interest groups. I think one of the things about Francis' authority is that he has tried to connect it with the work of the church on the ground, and that's where he sees the real action and activity of the church. It is amongst the parish priests, the diocese, the religious sisters, those people who are at the coalface. And so I think that, yes, he will make sure he has the right people in the right positions in the Roman Curia, but I don't think he's going to spend every waking hour trying to maneuver the different pieces of the chessboard all the time in terms of appointing the cardinals in the Curia. He is trying to bring the message of the gospel, the church's mission, to the world, and to reinvigorate the church on the ground.
What does it look like to you, Shaun? What this style of leadership that lets the opposition have it say, that goes silent in the face of accusations, that suddenly asserts its prerogatives in an almost defensive way in certain areas. We saw this on sexual abuse in South America, where Francis, was very stiff-necked and had to be forced off a position that was wrong and untenable. I mean, what do you make of it all?
Well, I think this is where looking at him, and again, forgive me, I'm a Protestant theologian, so I'm a piker at this particular discussion.
That's precisely why I want you to know. I want to know what you have to say.
He actually believes in the Holy Spirit. I mean, I had a conversation in 2016, just as the new dicastery promoting integral human development was being formed, and I won't name the prominent person I was speaking to in the Curia, but this person told me that in the consolidation, the one rule that Francis had laid down was, we can't fire anybody. Now you can bring in new people. And so I really think he does believe that the Holy Spirit is at work when you accompany people and when you have dialogue. These are not just formal, empty categories, but he does believe that transformation can take place besides taking people out in the alleyway and executing them or firing them, that he does have confidence that God can be at work. And I think the example you just cited a second ago, Paul, makes great sense, that his horrible response to the sex abuse crisis there initially, and when he was proven wrong, he repented. He admitted he had made a mistake, and he has now shown through his actions, at least in his both bureaucratic but personal work, that addressing the sexual abuse crisis is foremost in his mind. So here's a guy for whom it's not just about politics and organizational theory, but he really does believe God is at work in these processes. And so you don't want to over-determine that. You can't over-manage that. At some point, you have to trust that over the long arc, God will be active and there will be transformation as a result. And it's not because you hired McKinsey to come in and reorganize everything.
Beautifully said, and you remind me of how little reference I have made myself to the gospel or religion or the spirit and all this. Massimo, you're a theologian on top of everything, and as an Italian, you can tell me whether is this conversation, Ben, as it's been suggested in the Q&A, overly focused on an American approach? What are we missing here from the point of view of theology or from the point of view of long European culture that you can correct us on?
No, I mean, I'm an American, not as you are maybe, but I'm getting there. So maybe I'm getting.
Don't come too far.
Into that. No, I think that and I want to go back to Shaun's question. Why didn't I give too much attention to the first few years of Pope Francis and the Obama administration? It's that I think that one of the major stories of this pontificate is about how normal the United States for Francis is. It's not an exceptional nation. It's not the beacon of freedom. He doesn't have a destiny. And that has created in many Americans a sense of loss, of shock, and of who we are now. And this is part of the opening to China, which can be a problem for some Catholics, but for US Catholics is a particular kind of problem. So here there is a bigger geopolitical dimension, which is about the United States, because this pontificate exactly is not about the United States. And this has, being here as an immigrant has opened my eyes to this much more as if I had observed that back in Italy, probably.
I see you nodding, Amy, and because of your role in the Focolare movement, you've had a probably strong sense of the relative or lack of priority given to the United States in a positive way. And so is that what was resonating with you about Massimo's remarks?
I find myself going back to that image of the polyhedron, right? Where it's difficult to find the center, and there's an invitation to a deep appreciation of what's going on the ground in many parts of the world, and how that also shapes the perceptions, the questions, the sense of priorities that we have when we think about mission work in its largest sense, in the sense of bringing the life of the gospel into the concrete life of people and fostering that. And so I do think that is a difficult concept and kind of mind frame for US Catholics to wrap their head around sometimes, but I think we're getting there also with the infusion of people from so many parts of the world coming and playing such a vibrant role in parish community life. But yes, I do think that's the future. I think Francis is pointing us toward the future, and it will take us some time to absorb the full impact of that message.
What you said brings to mind something that Chris said to us before we were on a live event, and maybe by way of closing, Chris, can you, I'll invite you to speak about the missionary priorities that Francis laid out a few days ago, which in some ways are the priorities for a post-pandemic church.
Yes, I think that what Pope Francis has been pushing forward throughout his pontificate is a church that is missionary. He sets that out in Evangelii Gaudium, which is the kind of manifesto for his papacy. And I think with the pandemic, which is putting a lot of pressure on church structures, which is causing the church to reflect on what is essential and what is not essential, that text, Evangelii Gaudium, is coming to the fore, along with Laudato Si, which is the encyclical on climate change and other ecological issues. But the church that's going to emerge, I think, from the pandemic is one that there's going to have to be more missionary. I think it's going to have to be to keep things simple. It's one of the things that Francis has said. That's going to have to be more humble and more attractive, not self-referential, not obsessed with its own internal debates, but looking out. The Pope said he didn't say it, he delivered a message to the missionary societies, pontifical missionary societies. He said that stop looking in the mirror, break every mirror in the house, start looking out to the world. And I think that's been his consistent, there's been a consistent theme. And he's in his travels, I don't know when papal travel will resume, but in his travels, he's often gone to those churches that are very missionary, often smaller churches, not the big powerhouses, but the churches on the peripheries, and he's gone to support them. And I think he sees, a simpler church. And again, this is in continuity with Benedict XVI, who talked of a smaller church, but a simpler church, which is, I think, more impactful and which is more service orientated.
Amen to that. And if the pandemic allows a reset that would enable those early priorities of Francis' pontificate to reemerge, I think it would be a very good thing. We've reached the time. Thank you so much, Massimo Faggioli, author of the new book on the Liminal Papacy of Pope Francis. Thank you, Christopher Lamb, author of The Outsider. Thank you, Amy Uelmen and Shaun Casey, colleagues at the Berkley Center. And a special thank you to the participants who are viewing. The questions that have come in are at a level of sophistication that I could hardly follow them while taking part in the live event, but we're going to log them, and I hope we can address some of them on the Berkley Center forum, because it's a really extraordinary level of discourse just going on in the Q&A, and I'm going to savor it once we're offline. So thank you so much to everyone, and hope you'll join us for the next event coming up in a few weeks. Have a good afternoon.